Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we've got, a pretty unique challenge in front of us, a whole bunch of excerpts from a book all about Zen philosophy.
It's going to be really interesting, I think, to kind of look at this through a different lens than maybe a lot of Westerners are used to.
Yeah, it's definitely a different perspective. I guess to get started, like right off the bat, the book kind of throws us for a loop. It's saying that the word Buddha actually just translates to truth. So Zen isn't about some like external truth. It's more asking, what is awakening and what is awareness?
Yeah, and that right there, that's really key because that's suggesting that the truth you're looking for, it's already in you. It's not about getting more knowledge, but more about cultivating awareness, like directly experiencing reality.
That makes sense. And the book also talks about how important this present moment is. It even has this quote: "This shore is the other shore. This life is the only life, and this moment is eternity." But I guess that brings up the question of how we get to this awareness, this, what the book calls no mind. How do we get there?
Well, the book is saying that our minds, they're always thinking about the past or the future, and that's actually blocking us from real intelligence. Like if you imagine a still pond reflecting the sky perfectly, that's kind of like no mind. It's total clarity, and you see reality without your thoughts getting in the way. And that's how you really connect to right now, to this moment.
I like that. That's a really cool image. So how do we actually quiet all that mental noise? There's this story in the book about a disciple. He asks his master about the deepest understanding, and the master just says, "Tell him I said this is it." What is that supposed to even mean?
It's funny, right? He's not giving some complicated answer. What he's doing is he's pointing straight to you right now, this experience. That's the ultimate truth, the ultimate reality. You have to wake up from the dream of your mind. It's about experiencing this, the raw reality that's always there.
I see, I see. The book also says truth is already here. Let me shake you. Allow me to shake you out of your sleep. It's like a call to action, but how do we shake ourselves awake?
Well, Zen wants us to let go of all our preconceived ideas. Our ego, the stuff we're attached to, so we can see everything fresh, like we're kids again. And that's what the book calls rebirth, this shedding of the old, like slipping out of your mind's control.
So it's not about some future life. It's a transformation right here, right now.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Um, the book brings up this Zen master, Fudaishi, and he did some pretty unusual stuff. Like he would rap on a table and shout to kind of shock his students into awareness. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's definitely different. I think his actions were like symbols, kind of like a sudden clap of thunder. It's meant to wake everyone up. You don't usually think of meditation being like that. You think of calm and peace, but sometimes maybe you need that disruption.
Yeah, like a shock to the system to break through those mental walls. The book even tells this story about Fudaishi. He goes to see the emperor, who was expecting some deep philosophical conversation, and Fudaishi just raps on a table and walks out. And later on, one of the emperor's attendants says, "What a pity Fudaishi has never been more eloquent." Like his actions were more powerful than words.
Totally. It's like real wisdom. It goes beyond language a lot of the time.
Hmm.
Think about a really powerful piece of art. It can have so much meaning that you couldn't even put into words. There's that Chinese poet in the book, the one who says that true poetry exists beyond words and meaning.
It's true. They both, Zen and poetry, are pointing to something deeper, something our intellect can't fully grasp. What about those who, like, resist these experiences? There's a story of a professor who had this profound spiritual moment, but he just explained it away as, like, a psychology thing.
That happens a lot. It's that fear of the unknown, the fear of letting go of control and facing something that totally changes your view of everything. The professor's intellectual framework, it actually became a barrier for him. He couldn't fully experience it.
He was so stuck in his way of seeing the world that he missed out on something transformative. That reminds me of how the book talks about the accidental world and the essential world.
Right, right. It's saying that we get caught up in all the accidental stuff, our things, our achievements, what's happening around us. And we forget about consciousness, that essential world. We're so focused on the waves, we forget about the ocean.
It makes sense. And because of that, we end up living in a state of idiocy, as the book puts it. But what does that actually mean? Living as an idiot?
It's not about being dumb. It's about being so caught up in your own little world with all your desires and goals that you lose sight of the big picture. You're not connected to the whole anymore. It's like living in isolation.
So it's not intelligence, it's more about what we're focusing on. There's this contrast the book makes with Teddy Roosevelt coming back from Africa. He's got this huge welcome, a hero's welcome, and then there's a mystic on the same ship, and he gets off quietly and says, "I'm not home yet."
It's like Roosevelt. He's achieved so much in the world, but he's still searching for something outside himself. The mystic, though, he gets it. He knows that home isn't a place, it's this inner peace. Like, you're already there.
It's like the danger of getting caught up in mine, all the stuff we accumulate. We miss the eternal I, the true self that goes beyond all that temporary stuff. But how do we actually bridge that gap between the outer world and this consciousness inside us?
Balance. The book talks about Hote, the laughing Buddha. He was all about balance.
Yeah.
He didn't reject the world or anything, but he also knew how important it was to work on yourself, to find stillness even when everything's chaotic.
Yeah, he prepared for his laughter. It's funny because you don't usually think of spirituality being about laughter and joy.
I know. It's not all serious and somber. Maybe joy and lightness are just as important.
Totally. Then there's this story about a botanist. He's lowering his kid into a valley to collect these rare flowers. And the kid's just hanging there, totally calm, saying, "Why should I be afraid? The rope is in my father's hands."
Oh, wow.
It's like ultimate trust, right? Trusting in a power that's bigger than us. But what happens when we have to make choices? What about when there are all these jewels or like centers of awareness to focus on?
That's where the book says choicelessness is the way to go. It's about embracing all of who you are instead of just specializing in one thing. It's going against that whole societal pressure to pick one path and be an expert in that one tiny area.
I see that, and it makes sense. It's like the book says, why use an airplane like a bullock cart? We limit ourselves so much when we could be soaring. But how do you actually live that way in a world that's all about specialization? That's something I'm still trying to figure out.
Yeah, that's a big question. But before we get into that, what are your thoughts on everything we've talked about so far? What's standing out to you? You were talking about figuring out that specialization thing, and that actually leads right into the next part of the book. It gets into how self-consciousness can really hold you back. It even calls it a disease.
Oh, yeah, that really got to me, too. I mean, I'm always battling that inner critic, always second-guessing myself. How does Zen even approach that whole self-consciousness thing?
Well, the book makes a distinction between consciousness and self-consciousness. Like, real consciousness is just being present.
Yeah.
In tune with everything, without that separation of me and everything else.
So we're all part of this big dance, but self-consciousness makes us trip all over ourselves.
Exactly. It's like you create this ego, this separate self that feels isolated and tries to control everything. The book uses this image. Self-consciousness is like a stagnant pool cut off from the flowing river of life.
Instead of just going with the flow, we build these dams and create all this resistance, all this tension. No wonder it's exhausting.
That's it. And the book says this self-consciousness, it comes from not really knowing who we are. Like, if we truly understood ourselves, we wouldn't need validation from outside or feel the need to perform all the time.
That's a powerful thought, to
Wow.
be free from that constant pressure to prove yourself. But how do we even begin to understand this true nature, like the essence of who we are?
The book goes deep on the ego. It describes it as all these anxieties and tensions that we build around this fake sense of self. It's like we're constantly swimming upstream, fighting against the current.
And that's where suffering comes from, right? We're wearing ourselves out trying to keep up this illusion that we're in control.
You got it. True happiness, at least according to the book, it comes from aligning yourself with that flow of life, letting go and surrendering to the whole. There's this story, it's about a drunk guy. He asks Mullah Nasruddin for directions to his house, not realizing that he's actually talking to Nasruddin himself.
It's like we're always searching for something outside of us, when the whole time it's been right here inside us the whole time, like looking for your keys when they're already in your pocket.
That's a great way to put it. The book really stresses that point. Our true nature is pure. It's like the sky, unaffected by all the clouds passing through. It's not about becoming something new. It's about recognizing and embracing who you already are.
There's another story that illustrates this perfectly. It's about a man mourning the death of his adopted son, but he never grieved for not having a son before the adoption. It seems illogical, but
Yeah, it's weird, right? But it shows how attached we are to things that don't last. To situations, possessions. The external world is always changing, so when we cling to it, we're setting ourselves up for suffering.
it's like that mystic on the ship with Teddy Roosevelt. True home isn't about what you achieve out in the world. It's about that inner world, that consciousness.
Right on. The book is encouraging us to shift our focus. Instead of focusing on accumulating my and mine, all those possessions and achievements, we should be recognizing that eternal I, the real self that goes beyond all the material stuff. But doesn't all this detachment lead to being passive? Like, how can we act in the world if we're not striving for anything?
That's a good point. But this is where the book's take on creativity comes in. It challenges this idea that creativity is just for certain activities. It says that anything you do, any action at all, if it's done with awareness and devotion, it can be creative.
That's what makes Zen so cool. It's not just a set of beliefs, it's how you live your life. It's about bringing mindfulness and intention to everything you do, even making the most mundane stuff joyful and celebratory.
So even just doing the dishes or whatever, it can be an expression of our true selves, like Hote, the laughing Buddha. His whole existence was like an act of worship, pure joy, and gratitude.
Exactly. His laughter wasn't something he had to force, it just overflowed from within him. It reminds us that spirituality can be fun. It can be playful, lighthearted, even humorous. But doesn't this emphasis on letting go make us weak? How can we be strong if we're not pushing ourselves and asserting ourselves?
I can see why you think that. But the book addresses this head on. It argues that self-consciousness is what actually weakens us because it disconnects us from our true source of power.
It's like trying to lift something heavy with just your arm, forgetting you have a whole body to help. Real strength comes from aligning yourself with that flow of existence, surrendering to a power bigger than yourself.
The book tells this funny story about a wounded soldier. He's determined to find the woman he was supposed to shoot, even after he realizes he was tricked. It's kind of dark, but...
It's crazy, right? But it shows how our conditioning, all the stuff we've been taught, can make us act in ways that don't serve us. We're following a script instead of listening to our hearts, and that's what leads to suffering and feeling lost. But if we're not following that script, how do we even know what to do? How can we make decisions from this place of non-doing?
That's where the book's discussion of non-doing gets really interesting. It's not the same as laziness, which is all about being dull and unmotivated. Non-doing is the state of heightened awareness, being super present and alive.
Non-doing is not about sitting around doing nothing. It's about acting, but from a place of inner stillness and clarity. The book says that real decisions, the ones that are truly aligned with our best interests, they come to us naturally from this state.
So it's not about forcing things to happen. It's about creating space for clarity and intuition to come through. It's like listening to those whispers from your heart, that inner compass.
You got it. It takes practice, quieting all the mental noise so you can hear that subtle guidance from the universe. It's about trusting that wisdom to guide you. But how do we tell the difference between our own desires and this intuitive guidance? How do we know if we're not just following our ego's whims?
That's the million-dollar question. The book dives into this by looking at convenience as an enemy of real happiness. It's about challenging that urge we all have to take the easy route, even when it's leading us away from what would truly fulfill us.
It's like staying stuck in a job you hate just because it's familiar, instead of going after what you're passionate about. The book says that true happiness means getting out of your comfort zone. It's about embracing the challenges that help you grow and transform.
It's about choosing to be truly alive, even if it means being uncomfortable and facing uncertainty. You need to have a strong sense of yourself, be willing to stand out from the crowd and follow your own path.
This reminds me of that story about the boy who proudly shows his dad the trout he caught. And it turns out he caught it in a pool that clearly said, "No fishing allowed."
That's a perfect example of that rebellious spirit. It's about questioning the rules, forging your own path, and having the guts to be different.
And the book says that's how we find true freedom, how we discover our true selves. But what does that rebellion actually look like in practice? How do we balance being an individual with our need for connection and belonging?
Yeah, it's a tough one, right?
Yeah.
How do we balance wanting to be our own person with still wanting to connect with others and belong?
It's funny, the book actually brings us back to Hote, that laughing Buddha we were talking about earlier.
Oh, yeah.
He was so different, all that joy and laughter. It challenges that whole image of a spiritual person being all serious and isolated.
He just seems so fully engaged with life, finding joy in the everyday stuff. His laughter wasn't like he was ignoring the bad stuff. It was more like celebrating existence itself.
Exactly. For Hote, laughter was his way of worshiping, like an expression of his enlightenment. It's a good reminder that spirituality can be fun and lighthearted, even silly sometimes.
It's not about shutting yourself away from the world. It's about finding that joy right in the middle of it all. And it's interesting, the book mentions how Hote didn't want to be called a master or have a bunch of disciples. It's like he just embodied enlightenment through who he was, not through titles or followers.
That's a really important point. Real enlightenment isn't about status or getting recognition. It's about changing from the inside out, and then that naturally affects the people around you.
Like ripples spreading out from a stone dropped in a pond, right? His laughter created these waves of joy and awakening in others. But wait, the book also says he prepared for his laughter. What does that even mean?
I think it means it's important to do that inner work, to create the space within yourself for joy to happen naturally. It's not about forcing happiness, but about setting the stage for it to come out on its own.
It's like tending a garden. You have to
But
cultivate the soil to help things grow. But doesn't that kind of go against the idea of surrender we talked about before? Where does effort fit into all of this?
it's about finding that sweet spot between putting in effort and letting go, between engaging with the world and taking time for stillness, like breathing in and out, expanding and contracting.
The book contrasts Hote with those who preach about giving up worldly things but are secretly holding on to desires. It's like a warning about denying our human nature.
Yeah, it's dangerous to suppress our natural instincts, to pretend to be something we're not. Real fulfillment comes from finding healthy ways to express those desires, not trying to ignore or bury them.
It takes honesty, being aware of ourselves, the good and the bad. This makes me think about compassion. It feels like it comes naturally when you accept yourself like that.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
The book says compassion isn't something you force, it just blossoms when you're whole on the inside. It's about understanding and feeling the suffering of others, not from a place of pity, but because you've been there yourself.
It's like that line from the book. It's through our own wounds that we learn how to heal the wounds of others. So how do we cultivate that compassion in a world that feels so divided and disconnected?
It comes back to remembering that we're all connected, seeing ourselves in other people, and seeing them in ourselves. It's about breaking down those walls of us and them, and realizing we're all human.
That brings us back to the whole choice thing again. The book is all about choicelessness, embracing everything about who you are instead of just specializing in one thing. But how do you actually live that way when the whole world is telling you to specialize? It's like this constant battle.
I know the book gets that, it recognizes that pressure. But it also reminds us that specializing often comes with a price. It can make us see things in a limited way, and we miss out on the richness and complexity of life.
Like using an airplane to pull a cart, right? We're only using a tiny fraction of our potential. The book is pushing us to question that, to explore everything about who we are, even if it means going against the norm.
It's about finding your own unique way to move through the world, to dance, to sing, to just be. But how do we know if we're really being authentic or if we're just being lazy and passive?
Well, the book is clear that laziness and non-doing are not the same thing. Laziness is about inertia, like you just don't have the energy or motivation. Non-doing is totally different. It's this state of heightened awareness where you're acting from a place of inner stillness and clarity.
So you're responding to what's happening in the moment, and your actions just flow naturally from a deep understanding.
It's like trusting the river to carry you downstream instead of fighting against the current. But how do you make decisions when you're in that state of non-doing? It seems kind of contradictory to let go and still make choices.
The book says that when you're in that state of non-doing, the right decisions, the ones that are best for you, they just come to you. It's not about forcing things or manipulating situations. It's about creating the space for clarity and guidance to appear naturally.
It's about trusting that wisdom of the universe, that intelligence that's in everything, to lead the way. It's a beautiful idea, but how do we actually put it into practice? How do we take these big ideas and apply them to our everyday lives with our jobs and relationships and all the other stuff?
That's what we work towards our whole lives, right? It's about bringing awareness, surrender, and compassion to every moment, every interaction. It's not about reaching some perfect state of enlightenment. It's about constantly refining the way we live in the world.
It's a journey, not a destination. And it's important to remember, even with all this deep stuff about Zen, to not take it too seriously. The author even jokes about how sometimes he wakes up and just wants to drive a truck instead of pursuing enlightenment.
I love that. It reminds us that we're all human, with all our quirks and contradictions. Enlightenment isn't about denying that. It's about embracing everything about who we are.
This deep dive into Zen philosophy has been a wild ride. So many insights, so many paradoxes. It's given us a lot to think about, and I hope it's inspired you to start your own exploration too.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with this thought. If society's always pushing us to specialize, what's that unique